Jack family disappearance. The Jack family's disappearance remains one of the most perplexing and tragic cases along the Highway of Tears in British Columbia, Canada. On August 2, 1989, Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack, a hardworking family from Prince George, mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving the local community and the broader region in a state of confusion and disbelief. Their sudden disappearance adds to the long list of unsolved cases in an area known for a disturbing number of missing persons, particularly along the stretch of highway that has earned its grim nickname. Ronald Ronnie Paul Jack, born in Burns Lake on March 29, 1963, was raised in a modest household by his mother, Mabel Jack. The details of his upbringing are scarce, but what is known is that he was part of the Chislata Carrier Nation, an indigenous people of British Columbia. The Chislata are one of the many First Nations in the central interior of the province, with deep cultural roots tied to the Nechako River and its historical role as a trade route. The region, rich in natural resources, was home to many indigenous communities who relied on the land and its rivers for sustenance and trade. Burns Lake, a small but industrious village with a population of just over 1,000, was where Ronnie and his family lived, working in the local industries such as logging, mining, and sawmilling. Despite their simple life, the Jack family's story would take a harrowing turn as their disappearance added another layer to the unresolved mysteries that have haunted the Highway of Tears for decades. The disappearance of the Jack family is still shrouded in mystery. The Highway of Tears, known for its eerie reputation due to numerous disappearances, continues to be a location of significant concern and investigation. Yet, the Jack family's case remains unsolved, despite years of attempts by authorities to uncover the truth. The questions remain: what happened to Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack? Was their disappearance tied to the growing list of unresolved cases along the highway? Or was it something else entirely? The Chislata Carrier Nation is spread across 8 reserves based on the south shores of Francois Lake, and has about 340 current-day members, living both on and off the reservations. Along with those approximately 340 members was Doreen and Jack, a fellow native to the Carrier people and childhood friend of Ronnie. Doreen was born on April 24, 1963. She has a more well-known yet darker upbringing. Doreen had 4 other sisters by the name of Marlene, Laureen, Jocelyn, and Charlize, fostering a close relationship with each of them early on in life. Their mother left when they were toddlers, leaving them at the hands of their incredibly abusive father. Marlene Jack would later speak at a panel in 2017 discussing the tribulations her sisters endured and the horrifying stories of sexual assault and authoritative punishment dealt by their father and the men he'd bring home after nights of drinking. Marlene did her best to protect her younger sister Doreen from the violence, but there weren't many places the sisters could escape to avoid the wrath of their father and his cronies. All that being said, the evil nature of the family's patriarch wasn't the only thing to define Doreen and her sisters. They truly did hold a close bond with one another. They enjoyed hanging out at the rodeo in the summer months and racing cars with their uncle. Marlene loved to tell the story of a time when Doreen and her uncle raced on the highway between Burns Lake and Prince George, with Doreen coming out victorious when their uncle was pulled over for speeding by the highway patrolman. It was these happy flashbulb memories that kept the spirit of the sisters ablaze amidst troubled times at home. Sadly, the tight-knit sisterhood frayed at the seams later on when Doreen, Marlene, and the others were sent to Le Jack Residential School in Fraser Lake. It was here the nuns in charge would separate the girls when they came together for fellowship, roughly pulling them apart and telling them that they'd be useless when they were older to try and keep them in line. The demeaning tutelage eventually wore the sisters down, and they left the school without much volition, scarred by those who were meant to guide them into adulthood with confidence. Afterwards, Doreen and her sisters split up for good. Marlene moved to Vancouver's downtown east side, where she struggled with alcohol addiction and homelessness. She would occasionally talk to Doreen on the phone, but they basically fell out of touch too when Doreen settled in with her childhood friend, Ronnie Jack. Together, the couple had 2 baby boys. First, Russell, Fabian Jack on February 28, 1980, followed by Ryan Paul Jack on July 26, 1985. The family resided at a small apartment complex on Strathcona Avenue in Prince George, British Columbia, with Ronnie working at a nearby sawmill and Doreen at home tending to their sons. Their home life was also filled with some aggressive incidents as well, dealing with occasional domestic unrest and frequent arguments. In the late 1980s, Ronnie injured his back while at work at the sawmill and had to quit, leaving the family on welfare and struggling to pay the bills whilst caring for Russell and Ryan. Just as they were on the brink of extreme poverty and potential homelessness, the Jack family's prayers were seemingly answered when Ronnie encountered the offer of a lifetime to finally get their lives on track. That is until the track didn't exist, but rather led to Highway 16, an infamous route of tragedy and misfortune in the law of British Columbia crime. Let's now turn to the timeline of events that led to the unsolved disappearance of the Jack family. On the night of Tuesday, August 1st, 1989, Ronnie Jack spends an evening at the First Lita pub located at 1744 Strathcona Avenue in Prince George, British Columbia. The pub is an infamous watering hole and favorite bar of the Prince George locals, sitting just a few blocks away from the Jack family home. Ronnie knew the area like the back of his own hand, but found himself at the First Lita under hard times, recently laid off work due to back pain and surviving on the bare minimum of government money with his wife Doreen and his two sons, Russell and Ryan. At some point after dinner time, an unidentified man approaches Ronnie and sits at the bar next to him. He's described as a bearded and burly figure that the regulars at First Lita don't remember seeing around town. The bearded man strikes up a conversation with Ronnie, who opens up about his family's impending doom from the struggles with finding work and putting food on the table. A few minutes into the conversation, the bearded man presents Ronnie with a golden opportunity, a chance at redemption and hope that must have felt like winning the lottery. He tells Ronnie about an employment gig at a logging camp 40 kilometers west of the Bedtime area in the vicinity of Cluckhold Lake. He says it's the perfect job for Ronnie with his history in manual labor at the sawmill, and a way to reset his finances for the future of his family. Ronnie then asks the bearded man about his wife, Doreen. The bearded man has a solution for her too, claiming the camp to be like a ranch of sorts with an entire kitchen full of like-minded workers. He says Doreen can join in on the endeavor as a cook and make some money herself, only sweetening the deal in the hungry eyes of Ronnie Paul. But a couple of serendipitous moments later, Ronnie realizes a roadblock is sitting firmly in his path. His two young boys, who are of no age to either stay at home by themselves, let alone work at a logging camp. Yet again, the bearded man bears good news. He tells Ronnie that with the abundance of families at the ranch, there is daycare provided for parents who work, but need someone to watch over their children. He quickly assures Ronnie that Russell and Ryan will be looked after, and he need not to worry. By the end of the conversation, Ronnie beams with awe and gives thanks to the bearded man, who tells Ronnie to gather his family and pack up their belongings camp. Ronnie mentions that neither he nor Doreen own a vehicle, to which the bearded man offers to drive them. A few hours before the clock strikes midnight, Ronnie Jack walks out of the First Lita pub feeling like a new man. Like an Jack walks out of the First Lita pub feeling like a new man. Like an explorer who has just discovered a cavern of silver and riches after trekking through miles of fear and insecurity. He hurries home and shares the news with Doreen and the kids. They gather their things and prepare for the journey ahead. At 11:16 p.m. that night, Ronnie enthusiastically phones his brother and tells him about the conversation with the bearded man and the job opportunity at the logging camp. A couple of hours later, Ronnie calls his mother, Mabel, up in Burns Lake neighborhoods where they grew up. He shares the same information he told his brother, adding that he and Doreen plan to stay 10 to 14 days before returning home so Russell could start the next school year on time. Mabel wishes the family good luck and looks forward to hearing about their time at the camp once they return. Ronnie hangs up the phone, and this is the last confirmed contact the Jack family ever makes with their extended relatives. In the very, very early morning hours of Wednesday, August 2nd, 1989, at exactly 1:26 a.m., Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack are seen leaving their home at 2116 Strathcona Avenue and climbing into a four-wheel drive, dark-colored pickup truck driven by the bearded man. This is the last confirmed sighting of each family member. Over 3 weeks pass, and no one hears from either Ronnie or Doreen. They are officially reported missing on Friday, August 25, 1989. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly launch an investigation in late August. Authorities search for the logging camp in question, but find no evidence that such a place exists. They interview other patrons at the First Lighter pub and send out missing persons flyers with both information on the Jack family and the bearded man. However, no trace is ever established, and the precious hours after the report is filed are quickly gone in the night. The case grows cold over 6 long years before a significant tip finally comes into RCMP airwaves early on a chilly Sunday morning, January 28, 1996, when at 8:33 a.m., an unidentified man makes a garbled call to the Vanderhoof Police Department. It lasts only around 10 seconds and is incredibly hard to discern, but the man can be heard saying, quote, "The Jack family are buried in the south end of," and then an inaudible word followed by ranch. The name of whoever's ranch is mentioned cannot be made out, and the tip is sadly thought to be useless even after consulting audio experts to clean up the quality. In the following days, RCMP officers take their best guess at what the man could be saying in the clip and believe he may have said, "The Jack family are buried in the south end of Geordie's ranch." However, after searching a real-life ranch called Geordie's in the general area, no sign of the Jack family is unearthed. When investigators go back to the source of the phone call, they are finally able to trace the telephone's origins later that winter. They discover the call was made from a line in the Stony Brook, BC area near Vanderhoof. In fact, police found that there had been a house party in the same time frame the call had come through, explaining why the audio was so muffled, and they interviewed the guests who attended that night. Despite the breakthrough, the specific male caller is never identified, and once more, no new leads are surfaced in the hunt for the Jack family. The next and final major tip in the case wouldn't come until more recently, when just after the 30th anniversary of the disappearances, the RCMP announced an official search at a property on the Secor First Nation Reserve, just south of Vanderhoof, British Columbia. From August 28th through to August 30th, 2019, RCMP detectives carry out their search under the close watch and support of the Secor First Nation elected officials and tribal elders. They scan the grounds using bulky equipment, including ground-penetrating radar systems. Again, no trace of the Jack family is found. A month later, in September of 2019, Doreen's sister Marlene conducts several interviews with the Canadian media, claiming that a recent tip containing specific information related to the Jack family disappearances is being thoroughly considered by the RCMP and the surviving members of the extended family. What this tip is still to this day unknown, but both Marlene and the RCMP continue to ask that anyone with ideas relative to the case come forward, as all avenues are still being considered. In a mystery with over 30 years worth of materials and nearly 60 banker boxes stuffed with investigation documents, there is hardly any public information detailed by the RCMP regarding the Jack family disappearance case files. There have been leads and a few clues strewn about, sure, but even the relatives of Ronnie and Doreen Jack haven't been privy to the details researched and analyzed by detectives. Thus, we are left without any obvious fingerprints or vital documents from which to draw any reliable conclusions. What we do have, however, is a very detailed description of the bearded man seen with Ronnie Jack at the First Lita pub, who offered him mandarin jobs at a logging camp in addition to childcare. Henceforth, he will be referred to as the First Lita suspect, whom authorities believe to be the most pivotal figure related to the family's disappearance. There were 2 separate witnesses who attended the pub the night Ronnie spoke with the First Lita suspect, and each gave descriptions of the man to the RCMP. He was described as a white male, most likely of European descent, standing somewhere between 6 feet 6 feet 5 inches tall. His hair was reddish-brown and fell down to the bottom of his ears, parted to one side. While his skin was of a clear complexion, his face was covered by a mustache and a full beard measuring around 1 to 1.5 inches long. The First Lita suspect was certainly hefty, but not necessarily fat, ranging from anywhere between 200 to 2.75. With a fair amount of facial hair, it's thought that the suspect could either be older or younger than the anticipated age group. On the night he spoke to Ronnie, The first lead suspect wore a hat, a red-colored checkered work shirt, faded blue jeans, a blue nylon jacket of waist length, and work boots designed with leather fringes over the toes. For an even better image of the suspect's face, check out the 2 RCMP sketches provided in our case photo documents listed in the episode's description. In the years since these sketches and descriptions were released to the public, no one that we know of has come forward with a sighting or confirmation of who the first leader suspect could be. Of course, it is possible the RCMP has received such tips and refused to share with us the identities to protect the investigation, but as of now, we have no such lead. If the face of this man looks or sounds like someone you may know or remember from the Prince George area in British Columbia or anywhere around Western Canada in general, please contact the proper authorities. It's also important that we remember these details are 30 years old, so the physical features will have changed, and the man, if still alive, is most likely between 65–70 years old. The first leader suspect may not be a killer, but he certainly has answers that will provide a route towards justice in finding the fate of the Jack family. Let us now turn to the most prominent theories surrounding this unsolved mystery. With the lack of detailed information released to the public by the RCMP, there just hasn't been an abundance of theories discussed regarding who the first leader suspect may be or what happened to the Jack family. However, with the recent update in the case last September, it has renewed interest amongst sleuths and armchair detectives alike around the world. The newest theories revolve around men who fit the basic outline of the first leader suspects, a persuasive salesman with sinister motivations. One of the hypothetical offenders discussed is a man named Richard Beasley, well known for his infamous moniker, the Craigslist Killer. In 2013, Richard was tried and convicted for killing 3 men after soliciting work for a job via Craigslist in 2011. These false ads lured vulnerable men who sought better opportunities for themselves, promising them higher qualities of life in southeastern Ohio. Not only were the scams eerily similar to the first leader suspect's promises to Ronnie Jack in 1989, but Richard also bears a striking resemblance to an aged version of that infamous bearded man police sketch. While there are no accessible photos of Richard in the late 80s to make a true comparison, his height and theoretical weight matched the first leader suspect, as well as his slicked back, ear-length hair, and full beard. And even though Richard would have been just 30 at the time of the Jack family disappearance, he could have been identified as older with a scraggly beard and imposing demeanor. Sadly though, the similarities end there. While it is conceivable that Richard could have lived in Prince George during early adulthood and moved to the Midwestern United States later on, there is no evidence of Richard ever residing in Canada during his life. Whoever the first leader suspect was knew the surrounding area as well, making it likely they were a resident of British Columbia. In addition, Richard's victims do not match the Jack family's demographics. Both Ronnie and Doreen were just 26 years old with 2 young boys. The men in Richard's killings were all older white men in their late 40s, early 50s. Richard was also keen to influence his victims in bringing their belongings with them to Noble County, Ohio, robbing them first of their possessions before disposing of their bodies. This contrasts to the first leader suspect who seemingly wasn't interested in the material value of the Jack family, who owned next to nothing, had no vehicle, nor could fit many belongings in the suspect's pickup truck when they left with him. The Jack family killer was likely after the people themselves. While Richard Beasley hasn't confessed to more killings throughout his life, investigators do believe there could be more victims. So while the Jack family probably don't fit that bill, the Craigslist killer is at least the prototype of the suspects we're looking for. A more local suspect with legitimate connections to the Highway of Tears is serial killer Bobby Jack Fowler. While only 1 victim is confirmed to have died by his hands, Fowler is a person of interest in 16 different murders in both Oregon and British Columbia. In fact, the RCMP believed Fowler could be responsible for up to 20 homicides across northwest Canada. His modus operandi included driving across long stretches of road in beaten-up old pickup trucks, picking up hitchhikers, and seducing women in grungy dive bars, often sexually assaulting his victims after tying them up and beating them with anything he could get his hands on. One investigator told reporters that he spent time in a Tennessee prison for rape and attempted murder after savagely beating a woman with her own belts. and covering her with brush piles, leaving her to die. It's thought by some that Ronnie was another victim in Fowler's British Columbia bar prowls, and that Fowler selected Ronnie when he heard about his wife Doreen and their 2 children, knowing their financial hardships would make them easy targets. Fowler also had potential extensive knowledge of the area, working at a roofing company called Happy's Roofing along the Highway 16 corridor in Prince George sometime in 1974. We've even found one report stating Fowler was known to frequent the First Lita pub specifically. However, we must emphasize that we cannot confirm this connection. If it is true, it's possible he was there in August of 1989, and if he wasn't the bearded man, he could have a connection to the First Lita suspect or be in cohorts with some sort of large operation abducting indigenous peoples in the vicinity. Much like Richard Beasley, however, there are more details in Fowler's case files to suggest he isn't the First Lita suspect than to suggest he is. First and foremost, Fowler's age and physical description simply does not match the bearded man. Fowler wasn't as tall nor as bulky as the First Lita suspect, and had dark brown hair as opposed to reddish brown. He would also have been 50 years of age in 1989, a bit older than the suspected perpetrator. Fowler didn't target men or male children either, focusing on women traveling solo or lonely and inebriated women he found in the bars he visited. He certainly took advantage of unsuspecting people, but never displayed the wherewithal to kidnap an entire to warrant active consideration in the Jack family case. It should also be noted that not all the theories put forth revolve around serial killers. In fact, some have gone so far as to suggest that the First Lita suspect told Ronnie about the logging camp without the pretense of kidnapping or killing his family, but rather was honestly looking for hard workers due to the rigorous nature of the job. Then when the family arrived at the camp, they were not compensated for their labor. Ronnie and Doreen could have made their dissatisfaction known, and instead of sourcing the matter, the supervision decided it would be easier to make them disappear. Again though, this would have to mean the ranch actually existed. It is also hard to believe that anyone else at this logging camp would keep quiet about such a scandal. There would obviously be more people involved, and the cover-up would go to extensive lengths to be able to hide the murder of 4 individuals, including 2 children. It seems unlikely that investigators would not be able to locate the camp and search it for clues if the camp existed. Although it certainly is a compelling theory, there are perhaps too many coincidences for this to have been the case, and it makes little sense when all factors of the disappearance are strung together. A much more plausible theory comes from a specific circle of sleuths that believe Ronnie was behind his own family's vanishing. They claim that while Ronnie may have had a conversation with a bearded man at the First Lita pub the night of August 1st, 1989, no one has confirmed that what they discussed is what Ronnie informed his brother and mother of a few hours later. Some people wonder if Ronnie was looking for a way out of his current circumstances, and hired the First Lita suspect to help him get out of the area whilst disposing of his wife and children. Then he called his relatives to establish a shoddy alibi and disappeared into the night, never to be heard from again. While we personally don't believe this theory holds much weight, there were warning signs that Ronnie may have a dark side. In an interview in 2017, Doreen's sister Marlene Jack spoke of how Doreen was a victim of domestic abuse, not just at the hands of their father, but at the hands of Ronnie too. The couple were never officially married, and despite having 2 children together, it was known that their relationship was not in the best standing. All that being said, as horrible as the domestic violence was, it does not immediately make Ronnie a cold Jack family left without a trace intentionally are too far-fetched for serious consideration. If Ronnie wanted to escape his current life, serious consideration. If Ronnie wanted to escape his current life, he could have fled by himself. And if he truly wanted Doreen and the boys to come with him, why call multiple family members to tell them you're leaving seconds before climbing into the truck of a stranger? Of course, these questions are left unanswered, but they must be raised when looking at the big picture. Before we divulge our hypothesis of Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack's unsolved disappearances, we want to make known our conclusions presented in Cold Case Detective are purely logical speculation based on evidence, circumstance, and factual subtext. We are only privy to the same information presented in each episode, and we do not attempt to promise certainty or an expert guarantee on the findings we reach in closing. We simply observe, research, and report. In the case of the Jack family, we firmly believe they were kidnapped in the early morning hours of August 2nd in the hope that the first leader suspect was truly going to make their lives better at the fairy tale logging camp. We believe that the first leader suspect found Ronnie vulnerable in the pub that night, learned of his wife and children, and struck at their weakest moments. Knowing the patterns and tendencies of serial killers, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan were probably the perpetrators' intended targets, hunting women and children and using a desperate Ronnie as the vessel to reach them. We do not believe there was any job waiting for the Jack couple and that the truck they climbed into at 1:26 a.m. transported them to their unfortunate fate. This leads us to the ultimate question of who was the first lead of suspects. Obviously, at this point in time, it's impossible to pinpoint an exact identity, but there is enough to profile a general feeling for who he could be. Firstly, it should be noted that the First Leda pub is infamous in Prince George for hosting the criminal element in the area. There are hundreds of bars around town, but locals have said there are none sketchier than the First Leda. It would make sense then for the First Leda suspect to use such a nefarious locale as their hub of operation, knowing they could blend in with the fellow villainy lurking in its shadows. This leads us to believe whoever he was, the bearded man was also intelligent. He knew how to pick Ronnie out from the crowd, and did so in a way he never came across as up to no good. The first leader suspect came across as up to no good. The first leader suspect was also an excellent con man, able to sell an opportunity that seemed too good to be true from the onset, but enticing enough to draw in any rational human being. Sadly, this is a widely used tactic among serial killers and repeat offenders, using job postings and false employment advertisements to attract potential victims. If you remember our episode on Indigenous Canadian Ambritakaro, you'll probably remember our profiling of known sex offender and serial rapist, Pat Carson, who lured unsuspecting women and even couples to his horse ranch in Alberta with the guise of internships and life-changing opportunity. While nothing outside of his sexual assault charges have been proven, and while we do not believe him to be a suspect in the Jack family case, Pat Carson is living proof that these tactics work and that they are widely used. The bearded man is likely one of these types of criminals, cunning and subtle, hence why not even a trace of the Jacks have been uncovered. It should also be pointed out that because we do not have 100% confirmation that the family is dead, we do not have a killer's exact modus operandi to further weigh in the list of suspects. This last lingering uncertainty clouds the judgment of anyone who attempts to reconcile with this tragedy and makes concluding who might be at fault an immensely difficult task. Nevertheless, we will persist. Without a doubt, the best way of finding more clues and giving investigators the best chance at locating missing persons is raising awareness on the largest of scales so that motivated minds may come together and recollect that one memory or one experience that will charge the search with newfound optimism. It is optimism that must flood the paths towards justice for Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack. Optimism, not tears. For optimism is what drove these four souls into their final moments of happiness and contentment. This belief in a brighter future is probably the final bit of positive emotion each member felt, and therefore it will be the way we will memorialize their story. We will not let their legacy be that of the only family to ever go missing in Canada's history, nor let their legacy be just another tale of Indigenous peoples abused in a desperate situation. Indigenous peoples across America and Canada struggle to have their stories heard as it is, and in Canada struggle to have their stories heard as it is, and perpetuating the myth that it is somehow their fault they fell into the path of a criminal is a massive disservice to the individuals and their communities. The Jack family, like all those who go missing, are not mere statistics. They are individuals with lives, dreams, and potential. Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan Jack were hardworking members of their community, people who deserve to be heard and remembered. Their disappearance along the infamous Highway of Tears is a tragedy, but it is important to remember that their story is far from over. Their struggles, their triumphs, and their future aspirations should not be forgotten. The Jack family could have overcome whatever challenges they faced, and perhaps, they still have a chance to be found. There is always hope. Their story is one of resilience, and it is a reminder that people can change, grow, and impact the world in profound ways, even when faced with adversity. This case, like so many others along Highway 16, is a call for justice, closure, and the recognition of their worth as human beings. While the passage of time may obscure the details, the Jack family, and all those missing in the shadows of that highway, deserve answers. They deserve to be brought out of the darkness of that fateful night in 1989, and their surviving family members deserve to know the truth. Their story is not just a part of history, it is a plea for justice, compassion, and the hope that those who have been lost will one day be found. Moving on to the next case. Magdalena Pawlak and Robert Bylowski. In 1990, childhood friends Magdalena Pawlak, 16, and Robert Bylowski, 18, discovered they had developed romantic feelings for each other, much to the delight of their small community. By 1992, they had married, with Robert being 20 and Magdalena 18. Their relationship had been inevitable in the eyes of those who knew them, as they had grown up together in the same small town, sharing a block, a sandbox, and even primary school. However, their shared future would take a darker turn, as tragedy soon struck. After their marriage, Robert moved in with Magdalena and her parents in Legnica, Poland. While Magdalena stayed at home as a housewife, Robert struggled to make a stable living. He eventually found work selling gold at a local market, but also became involved in illegal activities, such as playing three-card Monte, swindling people for money, and smuggling alcohol from the Czech Republic. These actions would eventually lead to unforeseen consequences, altering the course of their lives forever. In late March of 1992, Magdalena became pregnant. However, Robert did not want the baby and urged Magdalena to have an abortion. He even gave her money to terminate the pregnancy. Magdalena, however, refused, and in March of 1993, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl whom she named Monica. Monica was said to be an adorable baby with short, curly blonde hair. Those who interacted with her noticed that she was a relatively calm child. She was loved by her mother, who described the baby as the sweetest girl. Monica was the apple of her grandparents' eyes. They absolutely doted on her and would often help Magdalena care for the child. Robert, however, Monica's father, never wanted to become a dad, and when Monica was born, he refused to take care of her. Refusing to accept any responsibility in regards to his lack of use of birth control, Robert shunned both mother and child and went to Italy for 6 months, claiming it was to earn more money, leaving his wife and child in the care of Monica's grandparents. However, Monica's grandparents believed that Robert did not leave in search of higher wages, but because he did not want any responsibility of a child. Magdalena's parents helped her financially and in taking care of Monica. Robert would return 6 months later, but still visibly hated his daughter and would say audibly that he was annoyed by her. He also held a grudge against his wife, as he claimed that the wife gave the toddler too much attention. He would often say in the presence of his wife and her family that raising the child required too much money, and that, quote, "This brat needs to be sold for which we could get a lot of dollars." He also claimed that Magdalena only had time for the child and did not love him anymore. Monica's grandparents hated Robert as well, as he never helped around the house or spent time with Monica. Both parties, however, avoided each other as to stave off conflict. Robert was also physically abusive towards Monica. Monica's grandparents had noticed bruising and pinch marks on her neck several times. It was found that the child had also been previously beaten and kicked. Magdalena recalled that once Robert punched the baby in the face in front of her. The mother at this point should have done the responsible thing and fled the house with the baby, not for her own comfort but for the safety of her child. However, this is not a story of people who made the right decision, but of many, many wrong decisions culminating in the worst tragedy any parent could experience. Shaped by the early abuse she experienced at the hands of her father, Monica was afraid when she saw her dad Robert, and would cover her mouth with her hands whenever he entered the room. On July 16, 1994, when Monica was only 1.5 years old, she came down with a high fever. Magdalena and Robert had made plans to go shopping that day, but of course Magdalena immediately wanted to tend to her daughter's health and go to the doctor. However, her parents told her that she could go shopping and that they would take Monica to the doctor. While the grandparents were in the process of leaving the home, Robert came running after them and asked if he could accompany them to the hospital. The grandparents thought it was odd as Robert had never cared for his daughter, but they thought maybe he had had a change of heart, so they agreed. Robert told his wife to go shopping with her friend and that he would meet her later. The grandparents noticed that Robert had a plastic bag with him. When they reached the doctor's clinic, Robert left and returned a half-hour later. The doctor, meanwhile, had diagnosed Monica with a cold and prescribed her antibiotics. On the way back home, Monica's grandparents wanted to stop to buy medicine from the pharmacy while Robert stopped at a payphone in order to call someone. Monica's grandmother went inside the pharmacy in order to buy the medicine, while Monica's grandfather and her father Robert stayed outside with her in a stroller. Her grandmother did not have enough money to pay, so she called her husband to pay for the medicine. Her husband went inside the pharmacy briefly, leaving Robert in charge of Monica. This would be the last time that Monica was seen by her grandparents ever again. When the grandparents came out of the store, Robert and Monica were nowhere to be found. However, her grandparents did not think much of it at the time, as they assumed that as Monica may have become more sick, Robert probably took her home separately. After returning home, they learned that Robert never arrived, and in searching around, they found that Monica's clothes and Robert's passport were both missing. Alarmingly, the numerous baby photos of Monica were also gone. It is at this point that they remembered that Robert had been carrying a plastic bag with him. They also remembered that Robert had recently applied for his daughter to be entered into his passport, which would enable him to cross the Polish border with her. At the time, Magdalena and Robert had been planning a trip to Italy, so the grandparents did not think much of it. Magdalena's parents urged her to call the police, and she did so, filing a missing persons report. The police took the case seriously and launched a massive search for the father and baby. Magdalena contacted friends and acquaintances hoping that she would find them there, but they were nowhere to be found. 4 days later, Robert called. Magdalena picked up the phone and immediately asked him, "Where is the baby?" Robert told her to meet him in a park near Kościostaw Lignis, and that he would explain everything. Magdalena went to the meeting spot, and her husband Robert told her the tragic news. Monica was dead. He claimed that he had taken Monica to the Czech Republic, where they had had a car accident in which Monica died. Magdalena was heartbroken, but she then started to question his claims. She began to wonder if Monica had died in a car accident. Wouldn't there be a police report? Wouldn't there be an investigation and a funeral for the death of such a young child? Something did not add up. She started questioning Robert and told him that she knew he was lying. Robert then said that he had actually been joking and that he really had given Monica to some gold traders from Katowice for safekeeping. He claimed he did this because he had wanted to hurt his in-laws. He told Magdalena that he would go with her to get Monica back. However, he had a condition. He told her that she had to withdraw her police report, which she had submitted in hopes of finding Monica alive. Desperate, Magdalena went to the police station and dropped the kidnapping charges on her husband. Magdalena then went to Katowice with her husband by train. Robert stated that the people he had given the child to would meet them at the Katowice train station. However, once they arrived, no one was there. Robert then claimed that they would actually be at the market. The couple searched around the market but could not find them. At some point during the search, Robert disappeared. Magdalena then went back to the Lignis police station and reported her daughter's abduction once again. Police immediately issued an arrest warrant for Robert. Interpol was also alerted, as it was believed that Robert had left the country. A massive search for the girl ensued, and Monica's mother and her grandparents pleaded on TV asking Robert to bring Monica back, but to no avail. Later, a friend of Robert recalled that the father had mentioned to him that he had sold his baby to an old couple. Weeks, months, and years would pass, but no leads would be found. Then 2 years later, Polish authorities learned that Robert may have been living in Vienna, Austria. Polish authorities contacted Austrian authorities, but they were not as eager to help. Around this time, Robert would call Magdalena telling her to come to him and that they could live a new life together and make a new baby. Magdalena contacted the police and told them about the phone call. Robert had told her that he would call her again, so the authorities decided to record his conversation and told Magdalena to try to get information about his whereabouts. During the call, Magdalena asked Robert where she could meet him, but Robert refused to tell her the details of his location. He told her, quote, "If you decide to come to me, I will give you an address in the Czech Republic. They will bring you to me from there." Police tried to track the number but were unsuccessful. The officers then decided to go to Vienna disguised as ordinary tourists, as they were certain Robert was hiding there. They were soon able to track him down and took pictures of him undercover. They wanted to catch him right then and there but realized that they had to follow protocols. They rushed the information back to Poland and presented the photos to police headquarters, who contacted the Austrian officials and presented them with the photos of Robert. On the September 29th in 1997, Robert was caught and extradited to Poland in order to face charges. During his questioning, he claimed that Monica was staying with a Polish couple living in Vienna named Zbyszek and Alicia. He claimed that he had met the couple at the Lignica market. The couple, he claims, were unable to have a child of their own, so he offered to sell Monica to them. After kidnapping Monica from the pharmacy, Robert recalls that he met with the couple who paid him 20,000 złotys for Monica. All of them then drove to Vienna. Robert said that he was supposed to have the option to visit his daughter, but that he got very busy and could rarely if ever visit her. He claimed that Monica was happy in her new home. During the subsequent interrogations, he would change his story several times, changing the amount of the sale and changing the appearance of the couple. He then claimed that Monica was actually dead. He claimed that she had fallen from a stroller in Legnica and had died. He said that he had buried her body in the suburban Zaltoria forest. Investigators brought cadaver dogs and searched the forest. They took Robert to the spot that he claimed he had buried his child, but he could not find anything. He again changed his story and said that actually his daughter had died in a car accident in the Czech Republic, which was the same story that he had originally told his wife so many years ago. Investigators checked, but there was no description of any accident like that happening in the country at that time. Later, Robert claimed that actually the true story was that he had gone to a grocery store in order to buy something to drink. He said that he had left the baby in the stroller in front of the grocery store. He claims that he does not remember anything after that, as he had taken 12 benzodiazepine pills that morning, resulting in memory lapses. He said that he doesn't remember if he took the baby with him from the store or if he left her there. When asked about the store's location or name, he could not remember. In another interrogation, Robert claimed that his in-laws had actually stolen the baby and sacrificed her. He also tried to fake mental illness by banging his head on the wall, screaming and threatening to commit suicide. However, the psychologist that was brought in did not buy the story and wrote in his report that Robert is, quote, emotionally immature and lacking in higher emotionality. The psychologist went on to say, quote, he would be able to act to get rid of his daughter by selling her, giving her away, and contributing to her death. Robert was also given a polygraph test, and when asked if he had killed his daughter, he showed signs of nervousness. In the fall of 1998, the Polish district attorney's office had his indictment ready, but as no body had been found and there was no actual evidence of a murder, Robert was merely charged with kidnapping and the selling of his daughter. However, it took time to send the indictment papers to the court, as they needed additional documents from Austria. Unfortunately, a year had passed since Robert was in custody, and in order to extend his detention, the consent of the Supreme Court of Poland was needed. The prosecutors from Lignica needed the approval from the General Prosecutor's Office in order to send an application to the Supreme Court. However, the General Prosecutor refused. As a result, Robert had to be released from custody. After his release, Robert unsurprisingly left the country and would disappear for the next 10 years. In 2008, Robert, through his attorney, contacted Polish authorities and told them that he wanted to stand trial and explain the case voluntarily, but with one condition: that they would guarantee him to remain free until the court issues the final verdict. In 2008, the trial would finally commence. Robert this time would testify that all of his previous explanations were not true and that he was actually innocent. He claimed that on that fateful day, he had actually taken a walk with his daughter while her grandparents were in the pharmacy. He then stated that he returned to the pharmacy and gave the stroller to his father-in-law. Robert claimed that he was already scheduled to go abroad that day and that his in-laws had known about it. He said goodbye to his in-laws and left. He claimed this was the last time that he ever saw his daughter. When asked why he had said that he had sold his daughter years ago, he explained that those statements were all made under duress. The trial went on for over a year, and in 2009, Robert was found guilty of kidnapping and selling his daughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, in the original deal, Robert had requested not to be arrested until the final verdict was given. Using the language of this appeal, he waited for the appellate court to finally review his case, and when the higher court upheld the verdict, Robert, before being remanded, escaped and fled the country once again. He would remain missing for 4 years. He would be captured again on 12th of September in 2013 by the Austrian police and again handed over to Polish jurisdiction. Magdalena Pawlak's heartache and determination remain, as she holds on to the hope that her daughter Monica will one day return. Even after nearly 30 years, the pain of not knowing the fate of her child has not faded. Despite her grief, the case remains open, and a recent development has brought a glimmer of hope. In the mid-2020s, a 27-year-old woman from the United States, after discovering that she was adopted, came across Monica's description in a database. Believing she might be Monica, the woman reached out to authorities. However, DNA testing quickly ruled her out as a match. Monica's grandparents passed away without ever finding out what happened to their beloved granddaughter. Now, as the years continue to pass, Magdalena's longing for her daughter only grows. She continues to believe that Monica might one day return, whether through a miraculous reunion or perhaps in a future life. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Monica Pawlak, please contact Polish authorities or Interpol. Your help could bring closure to this heartbreaking case. Moving on to the next case. Leslie Marie Perlov. Leslie Marie Perlov, a 21-year-old Stanford University graduate and aspiring law student, lived with her widowed mother in Los Altos Hills, California. She worked as a clerk at the North County Law Library. On February 13, 1973, Leslie was last seen at work. When she failed to return home that evening, her mother, Florence, reported her missing to the police. Leslie would always call if she would be late, so Florence immediately knew something was wrong. That same day, her 1972 orange Chevrolet Nova was discovered parked at the gate of an old quarry located near Old Page Mill Road. A few days after she was last seen, her body was found under an oak tree, west of where her car was found. She had been strangled. Investigators were able to retrieve DNA from the crime scene that was left behind by the person who took her life. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen a blonde man near Leslie's car before she went missing. After an extensive investigation, detectives were no closer to solving the case, and it went cold. Then, in July of 2018, investigators learned about new advances in DNA that might help them solve the case. They submitted the DNA from the unknown male collected at the crime scene to Paraban Nano Labs. A DNA profile was then created, and using genetic genealogy, they were able to identify 74-year-old John Getro as the person who took Leslie's life. He had previously served time in Germany for assaulting and strangling 15-year-old Margaret Williams in 1964. Getro served nearly 6 years out of a 10-year sentence for assault with fatal consequences. He was released after idiotic officials determined he was likely to lead a righteous life. Investigators were able to confirm that Getros also took the life of Janet and Taylor using DNA in 2018. Janet's case is very similar to Leslie's. On March 24, 1974, she visited her friends at Stanford University. That evening, 21-year-old Janet was seen walking along Junipero Serra Boulevard. The next morning, her body was found by a delivery driver. Her body had been dumped by a wooded area close to a bridge just off Sand Hill Road. Jana attended Canada College and was the youngest daughter of football legend and former Stanford coach, Chuck Taylor. Investigators always believed that what happened to Leslie and Janet were connected, but only proved it in 2018. John Gatros's trial was supposed to take place in 2020, but he fell ill and it was delayed. It is believed that he is responsible for more crimes and is still being investigated by the police. Leslie Perlov's sister Diane had this to say after hearing about the arrest. "I have been waiting for this call for 45 years, and now that it came, I am just a bit stunned. Not a day goes by that I do not think about Leslie in some way. She was my big sister, always looking out for me. She was and remains always with me." In September of 2021, John Gatros's trial started for the Janet Taylor case. He was convicted of taking her life on September 14. John Gatros was convicted based on DNA evidence obtained from a disposable coffee cup he discarded in 2018. This DNA matched samples taken from Janet Taylor's pants. On January 10, 2023, Gatros pleaded guilty, admitting to the murders of both Janet Taylor and Leslie Marie Perlov. His sentencing hearing is scheduled for April 26, 2023. Though decades passed, justice finally came for Leslie Perlov and her family. District Attorney Jeff Rosen stated following the plea hearing that Gatros will spend the rest of his life in prison. Moving on to the next case. Benjamin Benetti. On May 8, 1992, irrigation workers discovered the body of a man in Hidalgo County, Texas. An autopsy determined that he had been stabbed and had died about a week earlier. Despite efforts to identify him, investigators were unsuccessful, and the man was designated as John Doe. He was buried in Hillcrest Cemetery in Edinburgh, Texas. A composite sketch was released in the hope that someone might recognize him, but no leads emerged, and the case went cold. Hermelinda Chavez works for the Hidalgo County Major Crimes Unit, and she recently took another look at a case. They used the DNA sample they had of the John Doe and submitted it to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System to look for any matches. There they found a woman who they believed was the mother of the John Doe. The woman said that she had a son who went missing in 1992. After a DNA test, it was confirmed that her son Benjamin was indeed the John Doe. 19-year-old Benjamin Benetti lived in Zion, Illinois. He met a 17-year-old girl from McAllen, Texas in Illinois when her parents worked there. In March of 1992, he went to McAllen and got engaged to the girl. A week after Benjamin's body was found, his mom received a call from a mechanic in a Rio Grande Valley. The mechanic said had Benjamin left his car in the shop to get fixed but never picked it up. Benjamin's mother then reported him missing to a few local police departments. Sadly, the connection between a missing Benjamin and a John Doe that was found was not made until now. Investigators also talked to Benjamin's fiancée. She said that he received a phone call and that he told her he needed to go to Mexico and that she never saw him again. She never reported missing because her family made fun of her saying Benjamin left and used her. Benjamin's mom saved all the documents and letters that she sent to all local law enforcement agencies in hopes to find her son. She never gave up. She was determined to find him. It was because she submitted her DNA to National Missing and Unidentified Persons System that her son could be identified. Benjamin's remains were given to her so that she can give him a proper funeral. He was buried in Maple Park Cemetery. On the headstone he is described as kind and caring, a fine young man who his family will always love and never forget. If you have any information regarding this case and might be useful, you are asked to call this number. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Moving on to the next case. Guadalupe Vela. On January 10, 2023, the Manatee County Sheriff's Office in Florida announced the arrest of 40-year-old Pedro Garcia for the 2006 killing of 37-year-old Guadalupe Vela. According to the press release, Guadalupe and Garcia were rival gang members who had a heated argument at the Santa Fe bar in July 2006. The confrontation escalated as the two men took their dispute outside before parting ways in separate directions. Guadalupe went to a relative's home in Bradenton, Florida. While there, he saw Garcia once again and the two began arguing. Police said that this is when Garcia shot Guadalupe twice in the back, just as he was trying to leave. Detectives found Guadalupe's body in the backyard of the home along with the bullet casings and a witness who would not cooperate. Deputies stopped Garcia for a traffic violation nearly 3 months later and found a 9mm pistol in his vehicle. Garcia was arrested for possessing a firearm as a felon. Testing was done on the gun by Florida Department of Law Enforcement that ultimately linked the gun to the crime scene. But the rounds that Guadalupe was shot with came from a different weapon detectives found. Detectives continued to investigate the fatal shooting, talking to different witnesses who said Garcia spoke about taking Guadalupe's life. In 2015, Garcia admitted to another inmate at the Manatee County Jail, even providing details about what happened that night according to detectives. But the detectives were not told about the conversation until 2022. On January 9, 2023, detectives obtained an arrest warrant for Garcia, who was located at a home on 30th Avenue West and taken into custody. He was out on bond for an unrelated case. The detectives said it was possible Garcia was connected to other unsolved violent crimes dating back to the mid-2000s, and they asked anyone with information to call the Manatee County Sheriff's Office at 941-747-3011 or Manatee Crime Stoppers at 866-634-8477. Moving on to the next case. John Stagner. In 1992, 53-year-old John Stagner lived and worked in Orlando, Florida, as a maintenance employee for Orange County, residing on the county's maintenance property. On the morning of August 10th, deputies were called to a home on North Forsyth Road after John's wife discovered his lifeless body in bed. According to Orange County Sheriff John Mina, John suffered severe head and facial trauma, and the weapon, a walking stick, was found at the scene. The sheriff's office suspected John's neighbor, Ronald Cates. He had been a person of interest from the start. Cates reportedly had a drug habit at the time and would often borrow several power tools from John and pawn them to buy drugs. John had confronted him about it and asked him to return the tools. On the day John's life was taken, detectives went to Cates' house to speak with him about the case, but he had his daughter lie and say he wasn't home. Investigators later learned that he was hiding under the home that day. In the next few weeks, they did manage to interview Cates a few times. They noticed a lot of inconsistencies in the timeline that he gave and what his family members were saying. The case kept going. And in 1995, there was an incident where Cates admitted to his family that he took John's life. But because of how evidence and technology was at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to charge Cates. In 2020, a family member of Cates contacted Orange County Sheriff's Office about the cold case. The family member said that they really care about the case even if they were the suspect's family because John was very, very good to the Cates family. He would give them money at the time when they needed it or a place to stay. Detectives started looking into the case more and spoke to Cates' wife and daughter. In March of 2022, they began more extensive interviews with the family members. Investigators then learned that his family was in fear of him because he was very abusive to them. In April 2022, Cates was in a hospital in North Carolina. He told the nurse that he took someone's life in Florida in 1992. The nurse told a security guard and they did research and found John's case on the sheriff's office website. Officers with the Salisbury Police Department in North Carolina responded to the hospital and obtained Cates' confession on body camera video. Cates didn't explain the motive during his confession, but said that he hit Johnny with the stick. Investigators were able to confirm from Cates' family members that he used a walking stick to get around and that he owned the one that was found at the crime scene. Detectives then had enough evidence at that point to interview Cates again and charge him. Cates was arrested on August 5, 2022 and is being held in a North Carolina jail, waiting to be taken back to Florida. Orange County Sheriff John Mina said the sheriff's office started its cold case team in 2020. And since then, the team has solved 13 cases dating back to 1984. Moving on to the next case. Juliet Rivera. On July 17, 1992, a farm worker in San Mateo County, California, discovered the body of a woman near an irrigation pond. An autopsy revealed she had died from blunt force trauma to the back and left side of her skull, caused by a flat object. The victim was identified as 25-year-old Juliet Rivera, a legal secretary from Alameda. Juliet had been reported missing by her family 10 days before her body was found. Her boyfriend, 50-year-old Abraham Rivera, soon became a suspect. He also went by the name of Gregory Mark Rivera. The Alameda Police Department and San Mateo County Sheriff's detectives questioned Rivera. They noticed numerous inconsistencies with the statement that he had made. They also found other unnamed evidence connecting him to the crime. An arrest warrant was issued for Rivera on August 7, 1992, but by the time they went to arrest him, he was long gone. Detectives found his apartment in Alameda abandoned. Juliet's case was featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted soon after Rivera disappeared. Rivera was added to the website Northern California Most Wanted that is run by the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center aimed at enlisting the public's help in finding individuals wanted by law enforcement. On the website, it said that Rivera has a U.S. Army background and he has auto mechanic experience. He loves to talk about his times in Hawaii and has been described as a person who loved the Bay Area and likes to attend social events and local bars. The breakthrough in the case would finally come in May of 2022. A transient man, who was known as John Paul, passed away in Merced County, California. A coroner then ran the man's fingerprints in order to locate his next of kin. Results showed that the man was actually Rivera. It turns out that Rivera used his brother's name and lived a transient lifestyle to stay under law enforcement's radar. He and his brother would often swap identities to keep law enforcement guessing. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office had this to say in a statement. Based on this investigation with the identity of suspect Abraham Rivera, aka Gregory Mark Rivera, aka John Paul, finally located and now deceased, this case is closed. Public Information Officer, Lieutenant Eamon Allen, said, "Here at the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, a cold case does not mean a closed case. We investigate all cases thoroughly. Investigators are hoping that someone will come forward to shed light on why Rivera did what he did." Moving on to the next case. Vincent Marion Trapp. On March 12, 1992, the remains of a male were discovered in Sand Canyon, Nevada, after police received an anonymous tip. The area, located in Nevada's high desert, is approximately 100 miles from Reno. An autopsy revealed that the man likely passed away during the spring or summer of 1991. Due to the lack of identification, the man was named Sand Canyon John Doe. Efforts were made to reconstruct his appearance through clay models in hopes of sparking recognition, but unfortunately, no one came forward with any information. The case remains unsolved, leaving his identity and the circumstances of his death a mystery. He had auburn hair, blue eyes, at least one root canal, and 8 of his teeth were missing. In the vicinity of where the remains were discovered, a dark-colored hat with the words, "Heavenly Lake Tahoe" was found. Also, blue jeans, black underwear, black running shoes, a damaged dog collar, and a blanket. The damaged dog collar is interesting because a resident of the area that lives close to where the remains were found noticed the dog and would occasionally wander close to his house. It is possible that a dog belonged to the Sand Canyon John Doe. Lieutenant Jerry Pattinson of the Major Crimes Division of the Lyon County Sheriff's Office recently took another look at a case. He was listening to a crime podcast about advances in technology, combining DNA science of genealogy data. In 2020, he contacted Parabon Nano Labs. Parabon was able to find relatives of the Sand Canyon John Doe. A DNA sample was taken from a man who investigators believed was the brother of the victim. In May of 2021, it was announced at Sand Canyon, John Doe is Vincent Marion Trapp. He was born in Sacramento, California. He served in the U.S. Army in the late 1960s, Vincent was 43 years old when his life was taken. Investigators found that he lived in Yerington, Nevada in the spring of 1991. They also announced that they do have persons of interest but cannot disclose any names. An image of Vincent was made public by investigators hoping that someone has some useful information. Moving on to the next case. Nona Stamey Cobb. 29-year-old Nona Stamey Cobb lived in Cleveland County, North Carolina, and was a widow with a 3-year-old son named Josh. Due to a drug problem, Nona lost custody of her son, who was sent to live with her sister, Vicki Gregory. On the night of July 6, 1992, Nona was last seen at the Welcome Center on Interstate 85 in Cleveland County. She was observed getting into a truck driven by an unidentified male. After that, Nona disappeared without a trace, and her whereabouts remain unknown. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance have led to an ongoing investigation, but her case remains unsolved. The next morning at 6:15 a.m. on July 7th, her body was discovered on the northbound side of Interstate 77 in Surry County, North Carolina. She had been strangled and assaulted. Investigators collected male DNA from her body. It would take 3 years before investigators identified a suspect. They interviewed Sean Patrick Goebel. He was a trucker from Asheboro, North Carolina. Goebel denied having any involvement in what happened with Nona. He was, however, later convicted for taking the lives of 3 other women. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, plus 14 years in prison. Of course, this made investigators in the Nona case believe that he was the man they were looking for. Investigators took the male DNA they collected from her body and compared it to Goebel's DNA, but it was not a match. He was then ruled out as a suspect. In April of 2021, special agents with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Investigation Unit and investigators with the Sheriff's Office re-examined the physical evidence collected from the crime scene back in 1992. With the help of Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the founder of Identifiers International LLC, investigators were able to identify Walter Luther Alexander as a possible suspect by matching his DNA profile to the DNA left on Nona's body. Officers with the Diamond Head Police Department in Mississippi arrested Alexander on March 15, 2022. He is currently being held in the Hancock County Jail as he awaits extradition back to North Carolina to face the charges against him. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation emphasized that the investigation into Alexander remains ongoing and authorities are looking into the possibility that there may be more victims. Moving on to the next case. The Ravine Killer Case. The story of Almeria, a picturesque coastal city on the southeastern coast of Andalusia, Spain, is one of stark contrasts. While it is renowned for its Mediterranean beauty, rich food culture, and a haven for retirees seeking a warm, health-benefiting climate, it also carries a dark, sinister secret. Despite its idyllic exterior, Almeria became a notorious hotspot for crime in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and was home to one of Spain's most chilling unsolved serial killings. Between 1988 and 1996, a brutal serial killer known as the Ravine Killer claimed the lives of at least 10 women in this otherwise tranquil beach town. These victims, primarily working as escorts and living on the margins of society, were subjected to horrifying violence. The killer's modus operandi often involved raping and murdering his victims, then leaving their bodies in remote areas such as ravines, adding to the eerie nickname that became synonymous with the crimes. The victims were often women with few connections and families, many struggling with addiction or living on the streets, making them vulnerable and largely forgotten by the general public. Critics argue that this contributed to the slow response from authorities, who were accused of not taking the cases seriously enough, possibly because the victims were seen as marginalized or disposable by society. Organized crime in the area also played a role, as the city became notorious for drug trafficking, prostitution, and other illicit activities, which could have further obscured the investigation. The Ravine Killer's ability to evade capture for nearly a decade, and a seeming indifference toward the victims' lives, has left a deep scar in the community. Though the killer's identity remains a mystery to this day, the case has sparked debates about the treatment of women in society and the importance of giving voice to those whose lives are often overlooked. Authorities may not have fully understood the gravity of the crimes at the time, but the legacy of the Ravine killer serves as a haunting reminder of the need for justice for all victims, regardless of their social standing. And while Spain today has a far more tolerant socio-political stance on the business of sex, critics point out that the city's continued culture of violence against women is pervasive, as evidenced by the fact that even in recent decades, Almería has possessed the third highest rate of gender-related crime in all of Spain. At the time of the brutal killings, the murders did not cause a media frenzy nor social outrage, resulting in a lack of a proportional police response. This is unlike the much more well-known Spanish case of the death of the Alcazar girls, 3 young women kidnapped and tortured in 1992. The death of those 3 women received far more attention nationally due to the girls being of a higher social status, while the death of at least 9 escorts would be underreported and under-investigated. The first known act of this killer, who would go on to reign their terror for almost a decade, began on October 23, 1988, when a used auto parts dealer was searching for scrap metal from a ditch located on A334 road near the town of Piscina, about 30 miles or 50 kilometers north of Almería city. Noticing the putrid smell, he followed the scent and saw that a pair of human feet were sticking out of a sewage drain pipe. The body was visibly female, clothed in a red t-shirt which had a drawing of snowy mountains inscribed with the words, "Skydiving Sensation," written in English below the landscape. The victim had on no bottoms but wore red shoes. A later autopsy showed that she had been bludgeoned to death, and crime scene photos display the extensive injuries she received on both her head and neck. The medical examiner noted that her parietal bone was smashed. The parietal bones are flat cranial bone that covers the mid-skull, helping to form the shape of the head and shielding the brain from outside trauma. In this case, the bludgeoning she received was enough to crush even the most protective of bones. The forensic team also found out that the victim had suffered a broken right fibula about 2 years prior to her death. According to the autopsy, she had died in June or July of 1988. She stood just under 5'3", or 160 centimeters, and weighed around the 8-pound 145 or 65 kilograms. The victim's hair was strawberry blonde, and forensic experts estimated her age to be around 30 years old at the time of her death. Based on the ruggedness of the victim's skin and hands, investigators surmised that the woman may have grown up in a rural environment such as on a farm, and that she may have done a lot of physical work during her life. Internet sleuths later pointed out that she may have worked in Almería's greenhouse in the production of fruits and vegetables, as the area's climate allows for such bountiful harvests that Almería is a major source of off-season tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and melons for people all over Europe. This area is known as El Mar de Plástico, the Sea of Plastic, because of the many greenhouses which pepper the area's seaside landscape. The extent of police presence and effort in identifying the woman has been criticized, and to date no one has come forward to identify her. Investigators discovered that the victim had been killed elsewhere and later dropped into the sewage culvert. Detectives surmised that the woman was possibly tossed out of a car post-mortem by her killer or killers. Initially, law enforcement agents believed that the woman may have been in a situation where unsettled debt resulted in a revenge-based killing. However, taking into account later violent events in the area, that theory would be set aside for reasons with a far more dangerous implication. A serial killer was on the rise. The nightmare would continue on August 6, 1989 in the rural town of Valls Rubio, located just over 50 miles 85 kilometers northeast of Almería. A local shepherd was walking his flock of sheep in the pastoral fields during the early morning hours. After crossing the road near a construction site at kilometer marker 114, he stumbled upon the dead body of a woman in a ditch. The victim was naked, and investigators later commented that her body was already visibly decaying due to the high temperatures of the area. Police observed a large bruise on her neck and initially theorized that the woman had overdosed and had later been dropped off at the crime scene by her substance supplier to avoid incriminating themselves. A subsequent forensic exam pointed at a death not by overdose but by strangulation. Just like in the case of the unidentified woman found in June or July, this victim had died somewhere else and had been transported to the crime scene. The victim was later identified as 24-year-old Maria del Carmen Harida Alameda, a known sex worker who operated in the El Zapilos neighborhood of Almeria. She was last seen alive by fellow escorts at around 4 a.m. on August 5th in the same neighborhood she was known to work. Very few pieces of evidence were found at the crime scene, nor were there helpful artifacts on her body. Therefore, the case would grow cold. Perhaps the killer was satiated by the summer deaths enough that they were content to lay low, or perhaps they continued their murder spree elsewhere. But it was not until 1 year later, on August 28, 1989, that the third victim would be found. A French couple hiking on their honeymoon was enjoying photographing the landscape of La Ballena Ravine, located 1.2 miles or 2 kilometers west of Almeida City. What started as a sunny and scenic trek quickly turned dark when they noticed something strange located at the bottom of a nearby cliff. Upon further investigation, the body was found to be that of a female presenting with countless broken bones. The police were called to retrieve the woman as ambulances were unable to operate in such terrain. The unclothed body was in a place so hard to reach that an S-92 search and rescue helicopter was needed to retrieve her. The victim was later identified as 20-year-old Carmen Dolores Sandomaya Ramon, the daughter of a local German drug kingpin. She was known to work as an escort as well. Just like the previous victim, Maria, Carmen Dolores was known to frequent the neighborhood of El Zapillo in search of potential clients. A post-mortem examination revealed that she had been raped, and as in the previous case, she too had been strangled to death. Detectives postulated that the killer or killers had taken the young woman there after her death in order to throw her body off the cliff. Rumors began to circulate regarding a killer who was targeting sex workers. Many streetwalkers halted their practices of working outside, and many others left Almeria altogether. Those who continued their work on the street made sure to take precautionary measures. Such safeguards included practices such as noting the John's physical description, the make or model of his car, and the license plates. Escorts also began to heavily advocate for a more robust local police response to the wave of violence against women in the area, and perhaps such stringent safeguards worked as the killer would not resurface for over 2 years. On October 6, 1991, 2 workers found the heavily decayed body of a woman near a large greenhouse plant in Punta Ainidas, a town 18 miles or 30 kilometers west of Almeria. The victim was estimated to be between 25-30 years old and was 5 foot 3 inches tall, or 160 centimeters. Found wearing only a red bra, the woman had died due to blunt force trauma to her head. Originally, it was thought that the victim was English nurse Alexandra Lily Lai, who had gone missing while vacationing in Almeria around a month prior on August 30th. However, Lai's dental records failed to match that of the woman. Alexandra Lily Lai's body was later found buried in a shallow grave in the sand dunes of southern Spain in late 1991, a case police say is not connected to the serial murders. While police investigation indicated the unnamed victim was a local sex worker in Almeria, her true identity has never been unearthed. The next victim would be uncovered near what is now the luxurious neighborhood of Almerimar, known to some as Ensenada San Miguel. This area is situated about 25 miles or 40 kilometers west of the city of Almeria, and while Almerimar is now a modern beach resort, in the early 90s it was merely a maze of construction sites. Workers on such a site would have their labors halted on March 7, 1992 upon the accidental discovery of a nude female body face down upon the rocks. Later identified as Maria Jesus Munoz Borrego, 28, the victim, like the woman before her, was a known sex worker from the area of El Zapillo, and like the previous victims of what was now clearly a serial killer at large, Maria Jesus had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. Forensic autopsy revealed that she was later disposed of by being tossed off a cliff post-mortem. Unlike the other victims, the killer or killers had this time removed 2 souls from existence, as Maria Jesus was found to be 5 months pregnant. The mother-to-be's face showed signs of having been beaten. Her body, deceased prior to the disposal from a high height, fell roughly 130 feet or 40 meters before landing in the perimeter of the construction zone. Law enforcement officially began to refer to the unknown murderer as the ravine killer, as the bodies of victims often appeared in or around ravines or in other low-lying areas. On January 25, 1993, a German tourist was jogging on Agua Dulce Beach in an area about 6 miles or 10 kilometers west of Almería City. As the runner was utilizing a shortcut, she tripped over what she first thought was tall reeds, but upon looking back she realized she had stumbled over the body of a young woman. The body was subsequently identified as Maria Lyle Martinez. She was a 22-year-old mother who was married and trying to support her 4-year-old toddler by working as an escort in Almería City. Maria, like the others, was found stripped of all her clothing, and after being sexually assaulted, she had been strangled to death. A woman who also worked on the street told police that she had last seen Maria alive the night before she was found on January 24th. The witness recalls seeing Maria entering a vehicle described as a type of recreational sports car which may have been colored dark blue. The witness, whose name was withheld for privacy reasons, recalled that the car had a rear spoiler which was slightly dented. The car was eventually located and the owner questioned. However, detectives failed to find any evidence which incriminated him. By this point, both the police and the public were acutely aware of the brutal pattern which was emerging. Local police requested reinforcements from Madrid in hopes that the capital city would provide resources to combat the plague of a faceless killer. Just across the border, police in Portugal were dealing with their own serial killer in their capital city of Lisbon. Dubbed the Lisbon Ripper, this killer too was targeting women in the sex industry. Unlike in the Spanish case, this serial killer had the added calling card of eviscerating his victims. The FBI, already assisting in Portugal, were asked to consult across the border, and alongside local resources, they were able to create a psychological profile of the killer. FBI profilers surmised that the killer was a white male between the ages of 28 to 35, although the report noted the killer could be as old as 45. They theorized that the murderer was most likely married or in a long-term relationship, and that he would possess the somewhat horrifying characteristic of leading an otherwise seemingly normal life. The profile went on to detail that the male was likely of great strength and most likely was known to possess an unpredictable and explosive temper. The FBI went on to say that the man responsible for these deaths likely was intimately knowledgeable about local roads and terrain, and theorized that they may work in the transportation industry, possibly as a truck driver or a cab driver, allowing for less detectable travel amongst the provinces of Almería. Using this information, the FBI was able to cross-reference such traits from databases and cases in Belgium and the Netherlands. On July 5, 1993, just 6 months after the last woman was found, the 7th victim would surface. Some say that other victims may have been recovered during this time span but were never officially connected. Media reports indicate that there was a burned Jane Doe found in between the span of times that some theorized may have been another victim, but due to the difference in MO, she was excluded. The 7th victim was found by a local farmer who noticed the battered woman laying across one of the pathways among the many greenhouses at El Haido. The victim was a 25-year-old Moroccan woman named Khadija Mansar, known to her friends as Kadi. Autopsy revealed that Kadi had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. Her body showed artifacts of having been tied up as her extremities donned the telltale ligature marks. The killer or killers had placed a strip of duct tape on her mouth before she died. Investigators surmised that it was in order to muffle her screams to anyone that may have been nearby to witness them and potentially alter her fate. Notably, the 7th victim was found wearing only a red bra. Her shirt, pants, and underwear were later located buried underneath the wall of a nearby greenhouse. Detectives realized there was a trend in the clothing of some of the victims. Many of them were found wearing singularly red items, namely in their underwear and shoes. Police wondered if the color red might play into the killer's motives or if possibly the items were planted. Regardless of their origins, a pattern was emerging. On August 2, 1994, just over 1 year after the 7th victim was found, a resident of the neighborhood of Los Angeles in Almería was taking their usual morning walk and discovered the lifeless and naked body of a young woman near a local soccer field. The 8th victim was identified as 22-year-old Nadia Hakimar. Like the last victim, she was Moroccan, and like all the victims, she was a sex worker who was known to work the area of El Zaytul. The medical examiner wrote in his report that the victim had been raped and had later been strangled to death, a shared feature amongst the victims. Unlike the other victims, however, Nadia's autopsy showed that the person who had taken her life had made a vertical gash deep on both sides of her buttocks, although it is unclear in media reports if such wounds were inflicted pre- or post-mortem. Nadia's body showed numerous indications of a violent struggle, and forensic examiners hypothesized the killer may have attempted to leave misleading artifacts of the crime in an effort to distance himself from the now commonly known MO, instead tricking police into believing the victim was not that of a serial killer, but that of a robbery gone wrong. There was no blood found on her body nor in the surrounding area, an indication that the crime occurred elsewhere, and the body was moved post-mortem. Roughly 65 feet away, 20 meters, scattered among the brush were the deceased's clothes. Another connection that was made between the victims was their close and intimate relationship with notorious drug cartel members. While police were well aware of the homicidal predilections of such gangs, the possibility that Nadia may have been murdered due to her involvement in organized crime was brought up. However, police later changed their position and made the statement that Nadia too was a victim of the ravine killer, although they did not specify how they came up with that conclusion. In all criminal cases involving homicide, police must balance the burden of free press with the confidentiality needed in an active and unsolved case. This results in a precarious desire to both reassure the public of progress while also withholding enough details such that false confessions are more easily ruled out. A more clear pattern of victimology will be released after the successful capture of a suspect and during the trial of the killer or killers. So while police may have had a myriad of details in regards to why they deviated from their organized crime theory and instead officially named Nadia as victim number 8, so far media reports have not provided further details such as the color of her clothing. The 9th victim that authorities knew of was found on April 6, 1996. 2 fishermen uncovered the dead body of a woman at the bottom of a cliff near Agua Dulce Beach. The body was that of 24-year-old Aurora Amador Carmona, a worker of the streets of El Zaytul like the others. And like the others, she was unclothed and had been strangled to death after being sexually assaulted. A later autopsy would reveal that the victim had suffered a broken jaw as well as broken cervical vertebrae. The report indicated that she was thrown down the cliff post-mortem. The medical examiner noted that her major and fatal injuries were not caused by the fall but inflicted by a brutal beating. Police canvassed the area and learned that fellow streetwalkers had seen Aurora the previous night as she was getting into the car of a client. Witnesses recall that the car was a 3-door Opel Corsa, most likely gray or silver in color. As the unofficial co-workers of Aurora were panicked at the news of her death, police noted that they had the astuteness to still be able to remember a portion of the sedan's license plate, remembering that the last 3 digits were 5. With this information in hand, detectives were able to locate the vehicle in question, and with the vehicle, the owner's information as well. Initially, police were certain that this was the clue which would crack the case. However, it only brought upon more ambiguity. The car belonged to a prison guard from Granada, a city some 60 miles or 100 kilometers northwest of Almeria. Working off of the only strong lead that they had, investigators interviewed numerous co-workers and family members of the guard. Upon ordering a background check on him, a sexual assault arrest was uncovered. That prior history combined with the fact that police were able to place the man in Almeria at the time of 5 of the 9 murders led investigators to believe they had found their man. Co-workers and managers at the prison recalled him being highly excitable, generally agitated, and some said he was quite violent. He had been formally admonished many times prior because of his violent outbursts, and according to his co-workers, in one instance, he threatened to hurt another guard, a woman, with a hatchet over a small verbal argument. The guard was single and lived with his mother. The hunt for the smoking gun was on. With this info, investigators requested permission to wiretap the guard's phone, which they thought would give them the definitive piece of evidence in which to prove that the prison guard from Granada was the ravine killer. However, their search warrant was denied, and the funds for the case were relegated to another more politically beneficial case. Although the caseworkers never managed to get the prison guard arrested, these investigators contacted several prominent police agencies across Europe and North America. And in 2006, in a last-ditch effort to keep the case alive, they sent the official investigatory document to those agencies in the hopes of them finding a new angle which could lead to the capture of the killer. While Aurora Amador was the last official victim of the Ravine killer, many of those involved in the investigation believe that it is quite possible there are more victims. A woman was found naked and bludgeoned to death near the same place where Nadia Hatch was found in 1998. The woman could not be identified, however, and it has never been clear if she was a sex worker. Police have not entirely disregarded the possibility of her being another victim, although they have not linked them officially. This still unnamed killer was particular in his victim selection. The woman whose lives he cut short shared a pattern. Except for the 1988 unidentified female, all of them were short-statured with long wavy or curly brunette hair and dark olive skin. All of them were in their early 20s and 8 of the 10 women were confirmed escorts. Many of them hailed from households of dysfunction and therefore had their own dysregulations which often goes hand in hand with addiction issues. Based on the scant amount of witness reports provided, the killer's MO was well defined. He picked them up, drove them to solitary places in the night, and once in a place of isolation, the killer or killers would sexually assault the woman, after which would come death by manual strangulation. The medical reports surrounding the victims of the Ravine killer offer few concrete details, particularly when it comes to whether the women were disrobed before or after death. What is notable, however, is that most of the victims were found completely bare, except for a curious detail in certain cases, when the victim was wearing something red. In these instances, the killer or killers seemingly left the red item on the victim, a peculiar pattern that added to the mystery of the crimes. The investigation into these brutal killings was marred by delays and inefficiencies, as the authorities initially failed to take the case as seriously as they should have. One notable figure in the investigation was a prison guard from Granada who came under suspicion but was never formally charged. He was dismissed from his position in late 1997, not because of the suspicions regarding his involvement in the murders, but rather due to a history of violent behavior and multiple write-ups. His firing added to the confusion, with some speculating that his dismissal was more about internal prison politics than any connection to the killings. Despite these suspicions, the case was officially closed in 2016, 20 years after the death of the final confirmed victim. The lack of victim advocates, coupled with the complexities of the case, meant that resources dedicated to solving the mystery were limited, leaving the case with little progress. While some still hope for new leads or a breakthrough, the killer, or killers, have evaded justice, and the Ravine killer remains an open wound in the history of Almeria. The tragic truth is that, despite the horror these women faced, their cases were largely overshadowed by their marginalized status, leaving their families and loved ones without closure, and their stories lingering in the dark corners of Spain's forgotten crimes. Moving on to the next case. Bob Livesey. On the evening of February 22, 1979, Bob Livesey left for his night shift at Leland Motors, leaving his 14-year-old son Alan at home. At 6:30 p.m., Alan had his evening meal, and by 8:50 p.m., his mother, Margaret Livesey, departed to meet her friend Mary Ann Walker at the Queen's Hotel pub. Unbeknownst to Bob, Margaret was also meeting a man she had been secretly seeing, Frank Bamber. That night, Alan was left home alone, having been grounded for taking and crashing a car in defiance of his parents after being forbidden from attending a youth disco. Around 11 p.m., Margaret returned, dropped off by Bamber at the top of Collins Road North. As she walked home, she noticed 2 boys loitering near Mrs. Matthews' house, number 63. What followed remains a mystery. She recognized the 2 adolescents. They were Andrew Matthews and Tommy Rogers. She knew that the 2 teenagers, residents of the Crescent, had been getting in trouble with the police as of recent, and their shenanigans had included her own son, Alan, who had recently been in trouble for illegally driving and damaging various automobiles. Alan's mother also believed that he had been involved with shoplifting. Margaret knew that the 2 teenagers should not have been out at that time of night, so she decided to let Mrs. Matthews know that her son Andrew was outside their home. Upon seeing Margaret, the two boys ran away. Nonetheless, Margaret knocked on Mrs. Matthews' door to let her know about Andrew, and found both Mrs. Matthews and Mrs. Rogers, Tommy's mother, in the house having a drink. Mrs. Matthews offered Margaret a drink and the woman sat down to chat. A few minutes later, Mrs. Matthews' older son, Leslie, arrived home. Mrs. Matthews asked Leslie to go outside to find Andrew and Mrs. Rogers' son Tommy. Leslie went out to look for them but could not find them anywhere, and returned home empty-handed. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Margaret then asked him to go check on Alan. She reasoned that maybe the boys were with him. Leslie went to the Libby home and knocked on the door, but no one answered. He tried to peek through the window but could not see anyone in the house. However, the TV was on. He went back to his home and told Margaret that no one had answered the door. Margaret thought Alan may have fallen asleep and simply left the TV on. She gave Leslie her house keys and asked him to go in and check up on Alan. Leslie headed back to Alan's house and opened the door. As soon as he entered the house, he was met with what he described as a quote funny smell. He realized the house was filled with gas. He then made his way to the fireplace where he found Alan laying face down on the carpet between the sofa and the fireplace. He was dressed in his youth army uniform and had his hands tied behind his back. Leslie rolled Alan over and realized he was all wet. He noticed a red sock around his neck. As Leslie removed the sock, he saw multiple cuts and gashes around his neck. He was horrified. He tried doing CPR but nothing positive happened and blood spurted out of the wounds on Alan's neck. Leslie immediately went back to his home and notified Margaret. Both headed back to the home, and after seeing Alan's body, Margaret Livesey dropped to her knees and said, "Oh Alan, oh Alan." Margaret then tried to close Alan's eyes and said, "I don't want him to die with his eyes open," but this attempt was unsuccessful. Leslie tried to open the windows as there was gas throughout the home, but Margaret instructed him to call police immediately. Leslie went to the nearest phone booth and called police. The call was placed at 11:28 p.m. and is the only reliable time check in the entire timeline of the crime. The killer had turned on all the gas taps, but after finding Alan's lifeless body, Margaret promptly turned them off. When the police arrived just 3 minutes later at 11:31 p.m., the house was full of gas. So all the windows were open to clear the gas, which resulted in difficulty in estimating the exact time of death for Alan, as when the window was opened, it let cold air into the home. One of the methods used by pathologists in the 1970s in order to determine the time of death was by checking the body temperature. Alan's body had been first subjected to gas and then to cold temperature, which meant that by the time the body was examined at 2:40 p.m., the different temperatures interfered with determining the time of death. During their investigation, police could not find any sign of a struggle. There was no blood spatter on the floor nor on the walls nearby. There was blood on the carpet around the body, but no sign of blood on the furniture nor on the fireplace. If Alan had been attacked while standing, there would have been blood splatter on the wall around the body. Alan's clothing was rumpled, his vest and jersey pushed up towards his chest. This suggested that the killer had sat astride him and possibly had tortured him with the point of a knife before forcefully plunging it into his neck. 6 of the stabbings were deep gashes, while the other 4 were superficial nicks inflicted by the tip of the knife, one of which was a cut upon his eyelid. It seemed that the knife was placed on his eyelid gently, and then pressed down with just enough force to cut the skin. The red socks that were found around his neck had multiple cuts on them, suggesting that Alan had it around his neck during the stabbing and was stabbed through the socks. This explained why there were no blood spatters around the body. Alan's wrists had been bound with a necktie. The tie had been looped around both wrists and tied in the middle, bringing the wrists close together. It then went around each wrist individually and tied again. The 2 ends were then secured by a reef knot. The strangest artifact of the scene, however, was Alan's uniform. His mother told police that Alan had been wearing trousers and a jumper when she left the home around 8:50 p.m., but now he was wearing his Army cadet uniform and his new boots. He was a keen Army cadet and had joined in 1977. Police did not believe that this was a frenzied murder made in the moment of extreme anger, but that of a vicious game gone terribly wrong. The police searched the front as well as the backyards of all the homes in the Crescent, hoping to find the murder weapon, but to no avail. Police questioned friends and family as well as neighbors. The neighbors told police that they had heard noises coming from the Livesey's home, but they could not remember the exact time. Neighbors said that Alan had a habit of having other boys in his home whenever he was alone. The day after the murder, a witness by the name of Peter Nightingale came forward and told police that on the night of the murder, at around 10 p.m., he had left his friend's house in order to walk to his sister's home. His sister, Susan Warren, was the next-door neighbor of the Liveseys. Peter said that as he was climbing the back fence to go to his sister's back garden, he heard the kitchen door of the Liveseys being closed. He then saw a man walking down the back garden pathway, hopping over a fence and disappearing. Peter described the man to be about 5 feet 10 inches tall with whitish blonde hair which bounced when he walked. Peter believed that the man was probably wearing an anorak as he heard the sound of the material rubbing against his arms. Peter's sister, Susan Warren, who lived next door, was also interviewed by police. Susan said that she did not hear anything during the early part of the evening, but when she was putting her daughter to sleep just before 10 p.m., she heard a voice from Alan's home. She said that it seemed like Alan was fooling around with someone. Later, she heard Margaret shouting, "He's bloody dead," when Alan's body was found. Susan Lauren's boyfriend, Ronald Mason, was also interviewed. He too stated that he had heard the same noise around 9:55 p.m. He was sure of the timing because he had just finished watching The Streets of San Francisco, a TV series. He described the noise as, quote, various shouts, and had believed that Alan was fooling around with somebody. Later, he too heard Margaret's voice when Alan's body was found. With the eyewitness statements, the police initially believed Alan was killed by someone he was hanging around with that night, probably by a friend. Police then visited Alan's school and the local Army cadet headquarters in order to interview anybody who may have had knowledge about the murder, but no leads were required. Initially, police thought that a young man around 5 foot 10 inches tall may have been responsible for the crime. He was described as having white blonde hair and was possibly someone who hung around the LGBT scene. However, a few days later, police completely dropped that theory with no further details given to the media other than the fact that police were now completely shifting their focus and turning their sights on a new suspect, Alan's own mother, Margaret Livesey. Margaret would become a prime suspect after her two next-door neighbors provided additional details which they had not shared with the police in their initial interviews. Christine Norris was the right-side neighbor of Margaret, while Susan Warren was the neighbor on the left. While Susan's home was attached to Margaret's house by the common wall, Christine's house was detached from the Livesey home. Christine was also interviewed by the police early on in the investigation. She claimed that she had not heard anything that night except for when the police finally arrived at 11:31 p.m. She did not have much to say, and the police did not even bother to take her written statement at that time. But 4 days later, Christine talked to Susan and changed her story. In fact, both women changed their stories. Christine now claimed that she had actually heard a violent argument between Alan and his mother at around 10:45 or 10:50 p.m. on the night of the murder. Christine said that she was reading a book until 10:30 p.m. and remembered hearing voices from the Livesey home. She even said that she heard Alan cry out, quote, "Help me." She also told police that the relationship between mother and son were strained. She said that Margaret would give her son, quote, irritable slaps. She also claimed that the NSPCC had received reports about Margaret's alleged cruelty to Alan. The NSPCC is a child protective service aimed at preventing further child abuse. The agency talked with the boy, but he denied that his mother had hit him and did not show any signs of physical abuse. Christine also alleged that Margaret would lock Alan in his bedroom for hours upon end and that she would see him sliding down the drain pipe in order to get out of the house. When asked why she did not tell the police about this in her earlier interview, she said that she did not want to get involved. However, when she talked to her mother and to Susan Warren, she decided to come forward. Susan Warren would also be re-interviewed, and she too changed her story. She repeated her original story but also said that she had heard Alan and his mother arguing between 10:45 p.m. and 10:50 p.m. She also claimed that she had heard Alan's head being banged against the wall. In the second interview, she also corroborated Christine's and SBCC story. Ronald Mason, Susan's boyfriend, stuck to his story throughout the subsequent interviews and said he did not hear Alan nor Margaret fighting that night. On February 27th, 5 days after Alan's murder, Margaret Livesey was brought to the police station for questioning. She gave the same statement as she had in her previous interview. She said she was dropped off by Frank Bamber at the top of Collins Road North around 11 p.m. and then went to the Matthews home. The police, however, told her that her neighbors had heard her arguing with Alan at 10:45 p.m. Margaret denied it. When asked why the neighbors would believe that she would be shouting at Alan in the days prior to his murder, Margaret replied that as a teenager he was always wanting something and often did not do as he was told. She said that she had been worried about him as she had found 6 new batteries in his coat pocket which she believed had been shoplifted. The police then alleged that on the night of the murder, Margaret had been angry about Alan, so she had gone straight back to her home and in a heated argument with her son murdered Alan. They then alleged that she had cleaned up the murder weapon, a knife, turned on the gas taps, and walked a long way around the crescent, thus entering Mrs. Matthews' home. Margaret denied it and started crying. She then replied, "Well, if you said that I have done it then I must have, but I cannot remember." Margaret was visibly distraught and confused and started asking silly questions. She asked the investigators what her husband would think of all this. She also said that she could not go back to her house at number 41 The Crescent and asked if they thought that she should get a new home on Clayton Brook. The interview went on for 4 hours with Margaret ultimately confessing to murdering her own son. According to the police, she said that when she had come home, she walked into the living room and Alan was wearing his cadet uniform laying on the carpet watching TV. She figured that he had gone out of the house despite being grounded. She said that Alan denied breaking his grounded status. The investigator then asked her what she did next. Margaret reportedly replied, "I stabbed him and stabbed him." She said that she had used the kitchen knife which she uses for peeling potatoes. She said that she then covered his neck as she did not want to look at all the blood. Police supposed that she must have tied Alan up to make it look like someone else had broken into the home and murdered him. Margaret was arrested and charged with Alan's murder. She made a statement and signed it, but within 3 days, she retracted her confession and said that she had been coerced by police. She stated that she was confused, shocked, and debilitated and that the police convinced her that she had done it. She said that for a moment she even believed it herself. The police went to the Livesey home, and this time collected all the knives in the house. One of the knives seemed to have matched the murder weapon which the police had been looking for. This knife was found in the kitchen drawer. The knife had a wooden handle and one of the rivets from the handle was missing. However, a forensic examination of the knife did not reveal any traces of blood. The police seemed to have given up on the theory about a man with whitish blonde hair as described by neighbor Peter Nightingale, and instead they were completely focused on Alan's mother. On March 3rd, Peter's brother, Raymond Nightingale, was questioned and he told police that Peter had come to him and told him that he had never seen anybody leaving the Livesey home. He said that he had lied to the police because he was frightened. Peter was again questioned and he confirmed that he had lied to the police in his previous interview. He said that he did not see anyone coming out of the Livesey home at 10 p.m. The police eliminated the whitish blonde man theory and focused only on Margaret. Margaret was put on trial on July 2, 1979 in Preston Crown Court in Lancashire. Margaret had to undergo 2 trials both at Preston Crown Court. The jury at the first trial had looked at all the evidence and the confession by Margaret which had been withdrawn. The jury also heard statements from both women, Christine Norris and Susan Warren. The defense highlighted that both women had not told police the whole truth in their initial interview. The defense argued that both women either withheld information or lied about it because they did not want to be involved. held information or lied about it because they did not want to be involved. The defense also said that the timing of Susan's statements did not match. Susan in her second interview had claimed that she had heard an argument between Alan and his mother around 10:45 or 10:50 p.m. She claimed she remembered the time because she was watching the show The City at Risk and that it was almost near the end of the show that she had heard the argument. She said the program had ended at 11 p.m. However, the defense was able to prove that the program had actually ended at 11:15 p.m., which meant that the noise or the argument that Susan heard was actually after 11 p.m. The defense argued that she most likely had heard the panicked voices of Leslie, Matthew, and Margaret when they found the body of Alan. During her statements, the judge had asked Susan why she had given two different statements to the police when she did not want to get involved in the murder case. It was understandable, she said, that Susan may have not wanted to say anything, but why then go and say two different statements? The judge was curious how that prevented Susan from not becoming involved. Susan reportedly said, quote, "I do not know, really." Christine stuck to her statement that she indeed had heard arguing between mother and son between 10:30 and 11 p.m. as she had looked at the digital clock in her bedroom. Ronald Mason, Susan's boyfriend, stuck to his previous statement and denied hearing anything except the sound of what he described as Alan fooling around with someone around 10 p.m. He says he did not hear any arguments that night. Peter Nightingale was also called to the stand. He now reverted back to his original story of seeing a man with whitish blonde hair coming out of the Livesey home. He said that the police had pressured him into retracting his statement. He also said that he only said his statement was a lie so that he could leave the police station. He now stated that he was pretty sure he had seen a man with whitish blonde hair leaving the Livesey home around 10 p.m. Margaret's friend who was with her in the pub the night of the murder, Marion Walker, and Margaret's secret lover, Frank Bamber, were also called to the court. Frank Bamber said that they had not left the pub's car park until about 10:50 p.m. Marion Walker confirmed this and said that she had left them both around 10:50 p.m. at the car park when Frank was cleaning off the ice from his windshield. The journey from the pub to the top of Collins Road would have taken around 4.5 minutes. This meant Margaret arrived at the top of Collins Road a few minutes prior to 11 p.m. or even at 11 p.m. Frank recalls that he spoke with Margaret for about a minute or two while Margaret finished her cigarette and left the car. The prosecution argued that Margaret left the car and went straight home, a journey that would have taken her 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Prosecutors claimed that she then argued with Alan, tortured him, stabbed him 10 times, tied him up, washed off the knife, and turned on the gas taps. They then alleged that she walked around the crescent towards the Matthews home, a walk that would have taken about 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Margaret's husband Bob was also called in for questioning, and he said that his wife had a bad temper and had lied to him on numerous occasions regarding domestic matters such as paying bills. This had led to several arguments between the couple. After hearing all the evidence and statements presented, it was clear the jury was divided on Margaret's guilt, but during the first trial a close relative of one of the jurors had become ill, and he had been excused from the jury. This resulted in a new trial which was called in just 8 days after the first trial in the same city and in the same court. In the second trial, Susan, based on prior questioning in the first trial, knew about the discrepancy in her statements regarding the timing of the argument in accordance with the timing of the television show. So this time she said that she had actually heard the arguments much earlier, sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m. Mrs. Matthews also changed the timing of her story and said that Margaret had actually arrived at her home around 11:10 p.m. and not at 11 p.m. as she had originally claimed in her statement to police. While the first jury could not reach a consensus after 2 days of deliberation, the second jury took less than 5 hours and found Margaret guilty of the murder. She was sentenced to life in prison despite the witnesses changing their statements at the drop of a hat. In 1983, the BBC show Rough Justice aired an episode featuring the case called, quote, "The Case of the Tortured Teenager." The show examined all the evidence and came to the conclusion that Margaret had been wrongfully convicted. The show interviewed the neighbors, Susan Warren and Christine Norris, and they again changed their stories. They now said that they likely heard the noises after 11 p.m. probably when Leslie and Margaret found Alan's body. The show also found another witness, John Kershaw, who claimed that he saw Margaret at the entrance of the Crescent at 11 o'clock and 1 second p.m. He had given his statements to the police, but he was never called as a witness to the court. The show also went over the movements of Andrew Matthews and Tommy Rogers, as they had seen Margaret knocking on Miss Matthews' door the night of the murder prior to running away. Andrew had been at the local disco with his friend Tommy Rogers. They left the club and noticed the clock at the job center at the center of Bamber Bridge. The time was 10:55 p.m. It would have taken them about 8 minutes or less to reach home. Andrew and Tommy arrived home and crept under the window to see what was going on in the house, as his mother had not given him permission to go to the disco. Andrew was trying to sneak upstairs to his bedroom without getting caught by his mother when he noticed Margaret coming towards the house. That would put Margaret at Miss Matthews' home around 11:03 p.m. to 11 o'clock and 5 seconds p.m. It would have been simply impossible for Margaret to arrive at the top of Crescent at 11 p.m., then walk or even run the 2-minute and 20-second walk to her house first, torture and murder Alan, clean the murder weapon, turn on the gas taps, and then walk or run to Mrs. Matthews' home and still be at the house at 11:03 to 11:05. There was another small detail which the prosecutors had overlooked. When Leslie Matthews arrived at the Livesey home, he had smelled gas in the house. This, they believed, was obviously done by the killer, so that whomever entered the home would cause an explosion, destroying the incriminating evidence. If Margaret had killed Alan and opened up all the gas taps, why would she ask Leslie Matthews to check up on Alan, the only one in the home who did not smoke? The murderer most likely was hoping whomever entered the home was either already smoking or would light a cigarette after entering the house. Margaret did smoke cigarettes frequently, so possibly the killer knew Margaret would be the one to enter the house, thus causing an explosion. Another minor detail that was overlooked was the fact that Margaret had tried to close Alan's eyes after his body was found but was unable to. It is normal for the eyes to become rigid after an hour to an hour and a half after death due to rigor mortis. So if Alan had died at 11 p.m., or even between 10:45 to 11 p.m., Margaret should have still been able to close Alan's eyes. Mrs. Matthews and Mrs. Rogers, who had had a drink with Margaret, were also asked if they had noticed anything unusual about her. They both said they did not notice anything out of ordinary about the mother. They were then asked if they had seen blood splashes on Margaret, and both women denied seeing any blood. There were plenty of other details and evidence which had either been overlooked or not presented at the trial by prosecution. The first detail overlooked was the fact that prosecutors alleged Margaret had cleaned the knife that was found in the Livesey home, which they believed was the murder weapon. The knife in question had a missing rivet. If it had been used in the attack, it surely would have been stained with blood, but forensic analysis did not find any traces of blood. It would have been impossible for Margaret to completely clean the knife, as due to the missing rivet and the looseness of the hilt, the blood would have gone into the crevices of the wooden handle and would have still remained within the handle of the knife no matter how much one tried to clean it. If that knife was not the murder weapon, then where was it? The Crescent had been thoroughly searched by police, but the murder weapon was still not found. At no time did Margaret leave the Crescent either. It was a mystery how police would suppose that Margaret got rid of the murder weapon when she never left the crime scene. The show Rough Justice consulted Professor James Cameron, Secretary General of the British Academy of Forensic Sciences. He believed that the murder involved homosexual bondage, and that Alan may have consented to tying his hands and having someone sit on him. The killer then slowly dragged the knife over his body before inflicting serious deep cuts. This theory was based on the superficial injuries sustained by Alan. Professor Cameron reviewed the pathology report. He stated that from the pathologist's findings taken at 2:40 a.m., based on the temperature of the body and the presence of rigor mortis, the muscle stiffness after death, along with the way in which the blood had pooled into the dependent parts of the body, suggested to him that the murder had actually taken place about 5 hours earlier. This would place the murder around the time of 10 to 10:30. He also stated that the report cites little digestion of the stomach contents, and as Alan had had his last meal around 6 p.m., The professor estimated that Alan had died approximately 3 to 4 hours after his last meal, which would put the time of death around 9:30 to 10:30 p.m. He believes that the time of death is around 10 p.m. This would coincide with the noises heard by Susan Warren and Ronnie Mason. It would also coincide with the sighting of the whitish blonde-haired man by Peter Nightingale. The show also found evidence which was neither tested for forensic analysis nor presented during the court trial. Police had found 3 packets of cigarettes in the home, all from different brands. One Dunhill cigarette packet which Margaret and Bob used to smoke. One which was an unopened Player's No. 6 packet which was occasionally a brand smoked by Alan. But the third was most significant. The third pack of cigarettes, a pack of Benson and Hedges, were found laying on the carpet about 2 feet from Alan and were never presented to the court nor to the defense lawyers. No one in the house smoked Benson and Hedges. This was only later noticed in the photographs taken by the crime scene photographer. In the crime scene photographs, they also noticed several cigarette butts in the ashtray on a table near the body, but those were never forensically tested either. Another thing to note is the supposed confession by Margaret herself. In her confession, she stated that she stabbed Alan in the neck and put the sock on his neck afterwards because she could not bear to see him bleeding. However, the sock had cuts on them, suggesting that the killer had put them on before stabbing Alan in the throat. Moreover, Margaret claimed that she had tied Alan up after the murder, even though investigators believe Alan was tied beforehand and had had someone sit astride him. It was also questionable how police could justify the expertise in the knot tying. The binding on the teen's hands, complete with the reef knot, were unlike anything that the mother Margaret was capable of. Over the years, people have come up with their own theories. Some point to a copy of the Daily Mirror newspaper present in the room where Alan died, which featured torture methods utilized by paramilitary groups. If Alan and his friend had read this, that could explain why he was in his army cadet uniform and positioned so strangely. Some in the community wondered if this was a case of boyish roughhousing gone terribly wrong. Might the Daily Mirror article have inspired their own experimentations? It was theorized that the presence of the socks on Alan's neck could have been to shield him from actual stab wounds, but being teenagers, the boys did not realize that the knife would penetrate the sock. In this speculation, it is thought that Alan may have willingly laid on the floor in order to role-play such torture tactics, which would explain the lack of blood spatter on the wall or on the fireplace, as this would mean Alan would have started in a supine position. Margaret Livesey served in prison until 1989, despite a reinvestigation by West Yorkshire Police in 1983 and an appeal in 1986, both of which upheld her conviction. After her release on life parole, she relocated to Surrey to live near her daughter, Janet. In 2000, she returned to Lancashire, residing in a sheltered accommodation in Walton Liddell. 4 months later, Margaret passed away from throat cancer, maintaining her innocence until her death. The case remained stagnant until 2016, when a forensic review was initiated. Detectives began re-examining the evidence to determine if the case warranted reopening, but the results of the review remain undisclosed. Thanks for watching.